The wind carried salt and blood across the bay of Portobello that morning in 1683, when the Red Captain first set his boots upon the deck of the Venganza and swore to every man aboard that fortune would be theirs before the year turned. He stood tall beneath a crimson coat that billowed like flame, his voice carrying over the creak of timber and the lap of Caribbean water against the hull. Gold, he promised. Spanish gold from the treasure fleets that sailed fat and slow through these waters, weighted down with silver from Potosi and emeralds from Nueva Granada. Glory, he swore, for those brave enough to seize it. Not a man among them spoke of death, though death sailed close behind every promise made upon that sea. If you've sailed these waters in your mind, tell us where you're from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the Golden Age. The crew numbered 43 souls when they departed, most of them English and French rogues cast out from colonial ports for debts unpaid or murders committed in tavern brawls. A few were Dutch, silent men who kept their own counsel and cleaned their flintlocks with obsessive care. One was a mulatto from Barbados, who went by the name of Solomon and read the winds better than any navigator the Red Captain had ever known. They trusted the captain because he had taken 3 prizes already that year, modest merchant vessels whose cargoes had been divided fairly, and because his reputation preceded him, a man who had served under Henry Morgan during the raid on Panama and lived to tell of it. The Red Captain's given name was Edmund Crowe, though few remembered it. The crimson coat had earned him his title, a garment he claimed to have stripped from a Spanish admiral whose ship he had boarded off the coast of Cartagena. Whether the story was true mattered less than the image it conjured. Men needed legends to follow into darkness, and Crowe understood this with the cunning of a preacher or a confidence man. He wore the coat in blazing sun and tropical rain, letting it become inseparable from his person, a flag of defiance against every navy that patrolled these waters. They sailed west from Portobello, hugging the coast of the Spanish Main, where the jungle pressed close to the water and clouds gathered like conspirators above volcanic peaks. The Venganza was a sloop, swift and shallow-drafted, capable of navigating the coral reefs and hidden coves that larger warships could not reach. Her guns were few, 8 4-pounders, and a pair of swivel guns mounted on the rails, but Crowe had no intention of fighting fair. He hunted in ambush, choosing targets that could not run and would not fight long. The first week passed in tense waiting. They saw fishing boats and coastal traders, vessels too poor to bother with. Solomon scanned the horizon each dawn from the crow's nest, his eyes narrowed against the glare of sun on water, searching for the telltale shape of square-rigged sails that would signal a Spanish merchantman bound for Havana or Veracruz. The crew grew restless. Men gambled with dice carved from bone and drank watered rum, their conversations turning to the usual complaints of sailors, hard tack crawling with weevils, brackish water in the barrels, the endless heat that made the deck too hot to touch with bare feet. Crowe sensed the mood shifting and called the crew to assembly on the 3rd evening. He stood before the mainmast as the sun bled red into the western sea, his coat catching the last light like a banner. "Patience," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "The Spaniards are moving their silver north from Portobello. Our prize is coming. Trust in that." A man named Gifford, a former Royal Navy deserter with a scarred face and broken teeth, spoke up from the assembled crowd. "We've heard promises before, Captain. Words don't fill a man's purse." Crowe smiled, though his eyes remained cold. "Then let me speak in coin, Gifford. When we take our prize, and we will, every man aboard will receive a double share of what's customary. I'll take a captain's portion and no more. Does that suit your mathematics?" Murmurs of approval rippled through the crew. A double share was unheard of, a gesture that bordered on recklessness, unless Crowe knew something they did not. The promise bought him another week of loyalty, perhaps 2 if the winds remained favorable. On the 9th day, Solomon spotted sails to the northwest. The ship was a Dutch flute, broad-beamed and heavily laden, flying the colors of the Dutch West India Company. It was not the Spanish prize they had hoped for, but Crow made the decision quickly. "Run up the English ensign," he ordered. "We'll hail her as friends and see what cargo she carries." The deception worked. The Dutch captain, a man named Van der Meer, allowed the Venganza to come alongside, believing they were fellow traders seeking news of Spanish patrols. Only when Crow's men swarmed aboard with cutlasses drawn and pistols leveled did Van der Meer understand his error. The fight was brief. 3 of the Dutch crew resisted and were cut down. The rest surrendered. The hold of the flute contained sugar, tobacco, and indigo, valuable goods, but not the treasure Crow had promised. The crew's disappointment was palpable as they transferred the cargo into the Venganza's hold, leaving the flute crippled and drifting. Van der Meer and his surviving men were set adrift in a longboat with provisions enough to reach the nearest island, an act of mercy that surprised some of Crow's crew and troubled others. Pirates who showed mercy were often those with guilty consciences or political ambitions. Gifford confronted Crow in his cabin that night. The captain sat at a small table, studying a chart of the Caribbean by candlelight, a glass of stolen brandy at his elbow. "The men are talking," Gifford said without preamble. "That Dutch cargo will fetch a fair price in Jamaica, but it's not what you promised. Some are saying you've lost your instinct." Crow looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "And what do you say, Gifford?" "I say you'd better deliver on your word, or the crew will find a captain who can." Crow stood, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "I've sailed these waters longer than most of you have been alive. I know where the Spanish treasure is, and I know how to take it. But if any man wants to challenge my command, let him do it before the crew, not in whispers behind my back." Gifford held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded and left the cabin. Crow returned to his charts, but his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the brandy glass. He knew the truth that Gifford and the others did not yet suspect. The Spanish treasure fleet had changed its route that season, sailing farther north to avoid the pirate-infested waters around Portobello. The intelligence Crow had relied upon was weeks out of date, gleaned from a drunken Spanish sailor in a Jamaican tavern who may have been lying or simply mistaken. The Red Captain had staked his reputation on a gamble, and now he was losing. They sailed north, following the Cuban coast, surviving on the provisions they had taken from the Dutch flute and what fish they could catch. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly and tempers grew short. Fights broke out over trivial matters, an accusation of cheating at dice, a perceived insult, a dispute over water rations. Crow maintained order through a combination of charisma and calculated violence, flogging one man who drew a knife on his fellow and hanging another who was caught stealing from the common stores. The hanged man's body was left to swing from the yardarm for a day before being cut down and thrown to the sharks. A reminder that even among thieves, certain laws had to be maintained. Solomon approached Crow on the 10th evening after the Dutch capture. The navigator's face was troubled, his usual calm demeanor shaken. "Captain, the men are planning something. I've heard talk in the forecastle. Gifford is gathering support for a vote." A vote meant mutiny, a redistribution of command, according to the rough democracy that governed pirate ships. If the crew voted against him, Crow would be cast off in a boat or worse, and a new captain, likely Gifford, would take his place. "How much time do I have?" Crow asked. "A day, maybe 2. They're waiting to see if your promise comes true." Crow stared out at the darkening sea. "Then we need a prize. Tonight." Solomon shook his head. "Captain, there's nothing out here. We're sailing blind. Then we make our own luck." That night, Crow assembled the crew and announced a new plan. They would raid a coastal settlement, a small Spanish town called Puerto Escondido that lay sheltered in a bay 10 leagues to the east. The town was poorly defended, little more than a garrison of soldiers and a population of farmers and fishermen. It would not yield the treasure fleet's gold, but it would provide plunder enough to satisfy the crew's immediate needs: silver from the local church, goods from the warehouses, ransoms from the wealthier citizens. Gifford's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You said we'd take a Spanish galleon, not raid some miserable village." "And we will," Crow replied smoothly. "But first we need provisions and intelligence. The garrison commander will know the fleet's movements. We take the town, we get what we need, and then we strike the real prize." It was a deflection, a promise wrapped inside another promise, but it bought Crow the time he needed. The crew voted to proceed with the raid. They reached Puerto Escondido 2 nights later, approaching under cover of darkness with all lanterns extinguished. The town slept beneath a crescent moon, its whitewashed buildings glowing faintly in the starlight. A small fortress overlooked the harbor, its walls crumbling and its cannons unmanned. Crow divided his crew into 3 groups: one to secure the fortress, one to raid the warehouses, and one to seize the church and the home of the local alcalde. The attack began with a volley of musket fire that shattered the pre-dawn silence. The Spanish soldiers, caught sleeping in their barracks, stumbled into the streets in confusion, some without weapons, others firing wildly at shadows. Crow led the assault on the church himself. His crimson coat, a beacon in the chaos. The priest, an elderly Franciscan, tried to bar the door but was shoved aside. Inside, the altar glittered with silver candlesticks and a jeweled crucifix. Crow's men stripped it clean, while the priest wept and prayed in Latin. The alcalde was dragged from his bed and forced at gunpoint to open his strongbox, which contained a modest sum of silver coins and a collection of jeweled rings. His wife screamed until one of Crow's men struck her silent. Children hid beneath beds, whimpering in the darkness. By dawn, the raid was complete. The Venganza's hold was filled with stolen goods, and 3 Spanish soldiers lay dead in the streets. The rest had fled into the jungle. Crow gathered his crew on the plaza, standing before the smouldering remains of the fortress, which they had set ablaze to prevent pursuit. "This," he said, raising his voice above the crackle of flames, "is only the beginning. We've bloodied the Spanish crown, and now they'll come for us. But let them come. We'll be gone before they can gather a fleet, and we'll be richer for it." The crew cheered, their doubts temporarily forgotten in the rush of victory and plunder. But as they sailed away from Puerto Escondido, Crow stood alone at the stern, watching the smoke rise into the morning sky. He knew that raiding a defenseless town was not the same as capturing a treasure galleon. He knew that he had bought himself time, nothing more. The question was whether he could find the real prize before the crew's patience ran out, or before the Spanish found him first. The governor of Havana learned of the raid within the week. His name was Don Luis de Córdoba, a career soldier who had spent 20 years fighting pirates and privateers in the Caribbean. The news of Puerto Escondido enraged him. Not because of the plunder, the town was poor and its losses manageable, but because of the insult to Spanish authority. A pirate in a red coat had attacked a settlement under his protection and escaped unpunished. Don Luis dispatched 2 frigates to hunt the Venganza, each carrying 20 guns and a crew of experienced sailors. Their captains, Don Miguel Herrera and Don Alfonso Quintana, were men who understood the pirate mind. They knew the hidden coves and island refuges where men like Crow sought shelter. They carried letters of marque that authorized them to hang any pirate they captured without trial. Crow learned of the pursuit from a fisherman they captured off the coast of Jamaica. The man, terrified for his life, told them everything he knew. Two Spanish frigates were searching the waters between Cuba and Hispaniola, asking at every port for news of a red-coated captain. Crow released the fisherman unharmed, but the information weighed on him like an anchor. He called a council in his cabin, inviting Solomon, Gifford, and two other senior crew members, a Frenchman named Leclerc and a former buccaneer called Black Tom. They crowded into the cramped space, their faces lit by a swaying lantern. "The Spanish are hunting us," Crow said without preamble. "Two frigates, 40 guns between them. If they catch us in open water, we're finished." Gifford leaned back against the bulkhead, his arms crossed. "Then we make for Tortuga or Port Royal, find safety among our own kind." "And abandon the hunt for the treasure fleet?" Crow asked. "That's what you want?" "I want to live long enough to spend what we've already taken," Gifford replied. "This ship can't fight two frigates, and you know it." Leclerc, a thin man with a pointed beard, spoke up in accented English. "There is another way. We could take one of the frigates, surprise them at anchor, overwhelm them with numbers. With a Spanish warship under our command, we would have the firepower to take any prize we want." The suggestion hung in the air, audacious and dangerous. Crow studied Leclerc's face, searching for signs of mockery or madness, but the Frenchman appeared serious. "It's suicide," Gifford said flatly. "It's bold," Solomon countered. "And boldness is what's kept us alive this long." Black Tom, who had remained silent until now, nodded slowly. "I've heard stranger plans succeed. If we can find one of those frigates alone, catch them off guard." Crow made his decision. "We'll do it. Solomon, find me a place where a Spanish frigate might anchor for the night. A bay with fresh water, sheltered from the wind. We'll set a trap." The bay they chose was on the southern coast of Hispaniola, a place called Bahia Escondida, where a freshwater stream emptied into the sea and trees grew thick down to the water's edge. It was the kind of place a Spanish captain might choose to rest his crew and replenish supplies, confident in the remote location and the strength of his guns. Crow anchored the Venganza in a hidden cove 3 miles distant and sent scouts overland to watch for the Spanish. They waited 3 days, enduring rain and heat and the constant torment of biting insects. On the 3rd evening, a scout returned with news. One of the frigates had entered Bahia Escondida and dropped anchor. Crow gathered his crew in the failing light. "Tonight, we take that ship. We'll approach in boats, board from both sides before they can man their guns. Kill anyone who resists, but spare the officers if you can. We need charts and intelligence." Gifford stepped forward, his face grim. "And if this fails, Captain? If they're expecting us?" "Then we die," Crow said simply. "But better to die fighting than to run like rats until the Spanish corner us." They pushed off in 4 longboats as darkness fell, rowing silently across the calm water of the bay. The frigate loomed ahead, her hull black against the darkening sky, lanterns glowing in her stern windows. A few sailors moved on her deck, but most of the crew appeared to be below, eating their evening meal. Crow's heart hammered in his chest as they drew closer. Every creak of oar in oarlock seeming impossibly loud. 50 yards, 30, 20. A Spanish lookout spotted them and shouted a warning. The alarm bell clanged, and suddenly the frigate's deck came alive with running men. Crow roared for his crew to pull harder, and the longboats surged forward. Musket fire crackled from the frigate's rails, and the air filled with the whine of lead balls passing overhead. One of Crow's men took a shot to the chest and toppled backward into the water. The first boat reached the frigate's starboard side, and pirates swarmed up the hull, using grappling hooks and boarding nets. Crow was among them, his sword in one hand and a pistol in the other. He fired point-blank into a Spanish sailor's face, and then hacked his way toward the quarterdeck, his crimson coat bright with blood, some his own, most belonging to others. The fighting was savage and brief. The Spanish crew, caught unprepared, could not organize an effective defense. Their captain, Don Alfonso Quintana, tried to rally his men from the quarterdeck, but was shot by 3 pirates simultaneously. He fell without a sound, his blood staining the polished wood planks. Within 20 minutes the frigate was taken. 15 Spaniards lay dead. The rest surrendered. Crow's crew had lost 7 men, including Leclerc, who had been run through with a cutlass while storming the forecastle. They threw the Spanish survivors into the longboats and set them adrift with oars, but no provisions, a slow death sentence disguised as mercy. Crow stood on the captured frigate's deck, breathing hard, his coat torn and bloody. The ship was theirs, 24 guns, and a hull built to withstand Atlantic storms. They had done the impossible. Gifford approached him, wiping blood from a long knife. "You were right, Captain. We've got our warship." Crow nodded, too exhausted to speak, but later that night, alone in the Spanish captain's cabin, he opened Don Alfonso's logbook and found entries that made his blood run cold. The treasure fleet had sailed 2 weeks earlier, bound for Seville with an escort of 5 warships. It was gone, beyond reach, and the intelligence that Crow had based his plans upon was worthless. He sat in the darkness for a long time, staring at the logbook's pages by candlelight. He had promised his crew glory, riches, a prize that would make them legends. Instead, he had led them into a war they could not win, taken risks that bordered on madness, and killed men for a treasure that did not exist. But he could not admit the truth. To do so would mean mutiny and death. So he closed the logbook, locked it in the captain's desk, and went back on deck to tell his crew that the capture of the frigate was only the first step. The real prize, he assured them, was still waiting. They renamed the captured frigate El Castigo, the punishment, and sailed her toward the Windward Passage, the narrow strait between Cuba and Hispaniola, where ships funneled through on their way to and from the Atlantic. Crow's plan was to find a Spanish merchant vessel, take it as a prize, and use the plunder to satisfy his crew long enough to devise a new strategy. But the passage was empty, swept clean by the Spanish Navy in the aftermath of the treasure fleet's departure. Days turned into weeks. Supplies dwindled. The crew of the Venganza, now split between 2 ships, began to mutter openly about Crow's leadership. Gifford emerged as the leader of the dissidents, holding court in the El Castigo's lower decks, where he spoke in a low voice about captains who made promises they couldn't keep, about the difference between boldness and folly. Solomon tried to warn Crow, but the captain seemed lost in his own thoughts, spending hours in his cabin studying charts that offered no answers. The Red Captain's coat, once a symbol of defiance, now seemed like a mockery, a bright flag advertising failure. The breaking point came on a morning when the lookout spotted a sail to the north. Crow ordered both ships to pursue, hoping desperately that this would be the prize he needed. But as they drew closer, the sail revealed itself to be the second Spanish frigate, Don Miguel Herrera's ship, the Santa Teresa, hunting for the pirates who had destroyed her sister vessel. The Santa Teresa had the weather gauge, approaching from upwind, with all sails set. Crow faced a choice, fight or run. The El Castigo could match the Spanish frigate gun for gun, but his crew was divided and inexperienced with the ship's handling. A battle now would be desperate, and even if they won, more Spanish warships might be nearby. "We run," Crow announced, and the decision shattered what remained of his authority. Gifford confronted him on the quarterdeck in front of the assembled crew. "We have 24 guns and a crew that knows how to use them. We can fight." "And we can die," Crow shot back. "That ship has a trained crew and a captain who knows these waters. We run, regroup, and choose our battles." "The time for choosing is over, Captain." Gifford's hand moved to his sword. "You've led us on a chase for treasure that doesn't exist. You've turned us into hunted men. And now, when we finally have the means to fight back, you want to run like cowards?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crew. Crow saw the mutiny forming before his eyes, saw men whose loyalty he had bought with promises he couldn't keep turning their backs on him. "I'm putting it to a vote," Gifford declared. "All those in favor of new leadership say aye." Mitom. The response was nearly unanimous. Only Solomon and a handful of others remained silent, their faces troubled but resigned. The Red Captain had lost his command. Crow stood very still, his hand on his sword, calculating his chances. He could fight, kill Gifford perhaps, but the crew would overwhelm him, or he could accept the vote, hope for mercy that pirates rarely granted to deposed captains. "Well fought, Gifford," he said quietly. "The ship is yours." Gifford's eyes narrowed. "You're taking this well." "Because I'm a realist." Crow unbuckled his sword and handed it to Gifford, then removed the crimson coat and let it fall to the deck. "I've had my run. Do what you will with me." What Gifford did was neither merciful nor quick. He held another vote, this one asking whether the Red Captain should be hanged or marooned. The crew, sensing that Crow's death might bring bad luck, chose marooning. They rowed him to a barren island in the Windward Passage, a place with no fresh water and no shelter, just sand and rock and wheeling seabirds. They left him a pistol with a single shot, a cruel joke that every marooned sailor understood. From the island, Crow watched both ships sail away, the El Castigo and the Venganza moving south to meet the Santa Teresa in battle. He could hear the distant thunder of cannon fire that afternoon, see smoke rising above the horizon. The battle lasted until sunset, and when darkness fell, only the Spanish frigate remained, her sails silhouetted against the dying light. Gifford and his crew had fought as promised, and died as Crow had predicted. The Red Captain survived 4 days on that island. He drank rainwater that collected in depressions in the rock, ate raw fish he caught with his bare hands, and watched the empty horizon for sails that never came. On the 4th day, he found himself thinking about the promises he had made, the men he had led to death, the glory that had turned to ash. He thought about taking the pistol, putting its single shot to use. But some stubbornness kept him clinging to life, some refusal to grant the sea its final victory. On the 5th day, a Spanish patrol boat found him. The sailors, surprised to discover a living man on the barren rock, hauled him aboard and gave him water. When he was strong enough to speak, they asked his name. "Edmund Crow," he rasped, "the Red Captain." They delivered him to Havana, where Don Luis de Córdoba sentenced him to hang. The trial was brief, the verdict foreordained. Crow stood in chains before the governor and listened to the charges: piracy, murder, heresy, and crimes against the Spanish crown. "Do you have anything to say?" Don Luis asked. Crow looked at the gathered officials, the scribes recording his words, the soldiers waiting to escort him to the gallows. "I promised my men glory," he said, "but I gave them death instead. That's the truth of this trade. Glory is a lie we tell ourselves to make the dying worthwhile." They hanged him 3 days later in the plaza of Havana before a crowd of soldiers and citizens. His body was left to hang in a gibbet at the harbor entrance, a warning to other pirates who might think themselves invincible. But the story did not end with his death. In the weeks and months that followed, sailors in ports throughout the Caribbean began to speak of the Red Captain in hushed tones, not with scorn but with a strange reverence. They said his ghost walked the deck of captured ships at midnight, still searching for the treasure he had promised. They said the crimson coat washed ashore on beaches after storms, always stained with salt and blood, always disappearing before morning. A merchant captain claimed to have found the coat in a sea chest aboard a derelict ship drifting near the dry Tortugas. He swore he burned it, but the next day it appeared again, folded neatly on his cabin table. He threw it overboard, weighted with chains, and it surfaced the following morning, floating on the waves like a flag of surrender. The coat became a legend, a cursed relic that brought ruin to whoever possessed it. Pirates told stories of it appearing in their dreams, of hearing a voice promising glory, if they would only put it on. Those who did, the story said, sailed to their deaths within the year, victims of storms or Spanish frigates, or mutinies that ended in blood. 30 years after Edmund Crowe's execution, a salvage crew working a shipwreck off the coast of Jamaica pulled a sea chest from the ocean floor. Inside, preserved by some miracle of salt and pressure, they found a crimson coat with tarnished brass buttons and stains that could have been blood or could have been rust. Stitched into the lining were words embroidered in faded gold thread: Gloria et mortem, glory and death. The salvage captain, an old pirate himself who remembered the stories, ordered the chest sealed and dropped back into the sea. But one of his crew, a young man seeking fortune and fame, stole the coat that night. He was found the next morning lying on the deck, the coat wrapped around him, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. The ship's surgeon could find no cause of death, no wound or poison, just a body gone cold and still. They dropped the coat overboard for the final time, weighted with every piece of iron they could spare, and watched it sink into the green Caribbean depths. The young man was buried at sea that afternoon, his body sewn into canvas with a cannonball at his feet to ensure he rested on the bottom. But sailors still report seeing it sometimes, on nights when the moon hangs full and the wind carries whispers from the past. A flash of crimson on a distant wave, a shape that could be fabric or could be blood spreading across the surface of the sea, a promise written in water and salt, fading before it can be read. The coat remains below, among the wrecks and bones of the Golden Age, a monument to ambition and the men who died pursuing it. And if you listen closely on certain nights, some say you can still hear the Red Captain's voice carried on the wind, making promises of glory to those foolish enough to believe.